This episode is what I would call, a meta episode or really a bonus episode. We're not really going to talk about history in this episode. So if you want to skip it, it's totally fine. I understand. But if you're at all interested about how this podcast comes together, what the approach is, and how I start or approach research or picking the topics or really anything to do with this podcast, you might find this episode interesting. And if you do, just listen on. Well, we're going to have a short little episode just to talk about it. And if you don't, you can skip to the next episode. That's just fine. But anyways, I did want to just warn you ahead of time if you're expecting a history podcast episode. This episode, we're just kind of having a meta episode, just talking about the process. But next episode will be back to our regular scheduled broadcast. Hello, everybody. My name's Jeremy Agnew. I'm the host of the GrimDark History Podcast. And if you're just tuning in, this is a podcast that explores the intersection between history and popular fiction. And what we are doing here, what our process is or has been, our format, if you want to talk about it that way, is looking for some way to make this podcast unique, make it something that you want to listen to that's different from other podcasts out there. There's a lot of great history podcasts and much more qualified and probably competent historians doing podcasts out there. So what can draw you to want to tune in and listen to an amateur historian, someone who's a fan of history and not really a professional historian? What would make you want to tune in and listen to me talk about history? Now, maybe it's my voice, and if it is, tune in at 11 and we'll have a nice little DJ party. Or, if it's not just my voice, if I'm talking about something that interests you, it's because of the process that I take and the format of this podcast series. So, I want to be different from other podcasters out there. It's, our main kind of overarching theme is exploring how history and popular fiction intersect and interact with each other. We also start every one of our series with a story, a fictional reimagining that I try to attempt to attach you, the listener, to an important experience of that time and place to help provide context to you on what the rest of the series is. As the series goes, we have our little fictional story that's about some experience, and then we usually have a episode or two around the background of the main event, and then we get to the meat of the topic where we dissect the main event and how it interacts with the popular fiction that we're looking at. When I did the first series, it was on Copper Age, Anatolia, and the Proto-Hittite Anatolians and how they intersect with the novel Master of Mankind. And our first story in that series was the story of Otzi, who is a honest-to-goodness, real-life Copper Age human found frozen in the Italian Alps, who through genetic analysis we can tie back to Anatolian farmers who migrated out of Anatolia. We know a lot about Otzi's life because of the fact that he was frozen in the glaciers in the Alps for so long. He was almost perfectly preserved, and we're able to read tattoos that he had on his body, dissect what he ate for his last meals, and we were able to intimately create and recreate the last days of his life. So our story of Otzi was the story of really an everyday human in the Copper Age, specifically in the Italian Alps, but we rebuilt and retold or had a fictional imagining of what his last days were based on the actual real life evidence we have. And then we used that when we were talking about the second and third episodes in the Copper Age series. We kept drawing back to the story of Otzi to pull in context for what was being talked about at that time. In our next series, we talked about the Bronze Age civilization, the Minoans, who were based out of the Mediterranean island of Crete. We told the experience of a captain of a Minoan trading vessel who had his vessel destroyed during the tsunami that happened when the volcano in the island of Akrotiri erupted and collapsed, sending a tsunami across the eastern Mediterranean. Now, we picked that, or I picked that story, not only because our topic was on Minoans and the specifically the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, which is really, I guess, a Mycenaean myth, but based around the island of Minos and the Minoans. But we picked that because, A, we know the event happened. We know other civilizations wrote about it. And we know exactly what Bronze Age shipping and trading vessels looked like at that time, because there are real-life wrecks that you can find that have been pulled out of the Mediterranean Ocean just off the coast of Turkey from the Bronze Age that had detailed shipping materials still in its hull or strewn about the wreck on the bottom of the Mediterranean floor. So we had an amazing amount of detail about a teeny piece of Bronze Age trading and what that life might have looked like. So I use that to try and attach some human experience to a significant event in the Bronze Age so that you could have something to attach to while we discussed the rest of the Minoan series. Now, it also popped up again when we were having our very next series, which was on the destruction of the Tower of Babel, or what we would call the Etemenanki, the main temple of Marduk inside the city of Babylon. Our first episode in the Destruction of the Tower of Babylon series was actually the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And we could have ultimately been talking about anybody, any people at any time, because the experience of being in a siege is basically the same for almost everybody at any time. And there's actually a lot of documentation you can find of people either writing first-hand accounts, their own experience of having been in either a medieval or Renaissance siege, which would the experience would have been roughly similar. Or we have second or third hand accounts of people who wrote about that, or we have accounts written and reported from the besieging forces of what the aftermath was. So we could draw on that to help paint a picture of what the experience of the Babylonians would have been during what might be a clinical description of the city of Babylon was sacked and the tower was destroyed. So what were the experience of people during a siege, the famine they experienced, the trauma of being in a siege or city when it's being sacked, that sort of thing. So again, even though it's an extreme event, it helps attach a emotion to what a real event, what a real person would have experienced during that time. And as we come to our latest series, which is going to be on Alexander the Great, I find myself struggling. What experience, what story could I possibly tell that could connect me or you? What could anchor us to that time and place and person, and yet still be relevant to the story of Alexander? I've already told you the story of what the experience of somebody living through a siege would be like. I don't want to tell that again. And what story could I tell you about a man who lived as short and intense a life as Alexander did that you could emotionally attach yourself to? This is a man whose entire life was spent either training to be in war or being in a war. And I have no frame of reference to be able to approach it from that direction. I could try, but I think I would fail, and I don't want to fail. You know, this is a time and a place of extreme inequality inside Alexander's upbringing in Macedon. And we'll talk about that in our lead-up episodes, our background to the story of Alexander. But chattel slavery was an everyday thing. There was immense conflict in and amongst the area, and the destruction that happened really has no modern equivalent that I can compare it to. It's not quite genocide, but it's definitely still on the war crime level. He doesn't go out to obliterate or murder entire civilizations, but at the same time, I don't think twice about killing most, if not everybody, in a particular city. And I have no way to connect to that experience in a way that doesn't involve reading and researching some pretty horrific material. And it's not something I want to do, and it's not something I want to expose you to. I know at times the topic of this podcast can get heavy, but at the same time, I don't want to get graphic with it. It's not what I want to be about, but I don't want to shy away from the realities. But at the same time, I don't want to go into extremely graphic detail about that type of thing. But there is an experience that I can connect with, and maybe you can too. As I said, I'm a fan of history. I'm a student of it. I'm not a professor. I don't hold any doctors. I'm not a teacher. I'm not an archeologist. I'm not a historian. I'm just a fan of that. But my process and the way I approach every topic that we talk about is a lot of research. Now, what's great about modern times is historians and professors do post articles and contents online. Historical journals post material online. YouTube, a lot of professors post their content that they give from their classes and lectures on YouTube and other publicly available platforms. So when I start approaching any topic, I will find out what I can find about what's the modern take on a particular topic, and then I'll start doing general research, and from that general research I will usually home in on one or two modern takes, or as recently modern takes as I have the competence to find in a reasonable amount of time in order to get a podcast episode out. And so one of the things I talked about, or my approach was when I was looking at how do I research Alexander the Great, was what do historians that are writing or giving classes on Alexander the Great recommend you read today. And one of those things is probably the thing that's historians have been reading about Alexander since it was first written, and that is a book called The Anabasis of Alexander that was written by a Greek historian who lived in the 2nd century AD during the reign of Hadrian, the Roman Emperor Hadrian. So we have his account, or, as removed as it was, which would have been about 500 years, give or take, from the actual time of Alexander. But it is based on his own research and his own account that he can find of Alexander the Great's thing. But that's a Greek perspective. It's a Western perspective. And, that's fine. It's one of the books that even probably every historian, or at least that I could find when I was doing my research, if you want a basic place to start during researching Alexander, start with The Anabasis of Alexander. That's a book that itself I found needed its own translation. Even though it's written in English, you can get English copies of it, but it talks a lot about people and places and events that we have no modern context with. And if I can't have I can't understand it, how could you if I'm trying to talk to you about it? So I needed effectively a map of the ancient world so that I could, as I was reading through it, place Alexander at a specific time and place and understand how he moved about and who the people were who the people were that he was interacting with. So starting with that, I have at least a Roman, or Greek, but Roman influenced perspective of what Alexander the Great and his actions were 500 years removed from the event. But I was looking for materials on perhaps the Persian accounts of Alexander. Alexander, he raided Mesopotamia. He brought down the Persian Achaemenid Empire. There were a lot of Persian people there, and Persians wrote a lot of stuff. There had to be something available there that I could find translations of, English translations of, that other historians have written about, that I could read and then integrate, and maybe we would have a couple different perspectives that we could examine together, and I thought that would be really interesting. But as I was reading through the Anabasis of Alexander and making my notes, one of the things that just pops up continually throughout the entire 1,000-page novel is religion. And it pops up over and over and over again. And even though it's a one-liner, he made a sacrifice or worshiped the gods in his way, and then we moved on to the next people that he conquered or the next event he took upon himself. It kept popping up over and over and over again, and it became almost like one of those commercials for a product that you ignore, because I'm not particularly a religious person myself, and there are probably other people that listen to that podcast, and I make no judgments about anybody's religion practices, whether they do or don't. But like an advertisement that just keeps popping up over and over and over again, or maybe you're browsing YouTube looking for something interesting to see, and there's that one YouTube video that every time you go to YouTube, I don't click on it, it's there, just keeps showing to me, click me, click me, click me, click me, and finally you click on it and you think, geez, this is interesting, why didn't I wait so long to click on it? But that's what clicked on it when I was thinking about what can tie us in a way that we can understand, even if we are not ourselves religious or practicing religion. Even today in the modern times, we can attach ourselves emotionally and spiritually to somebody having a religious experience. And so that is the process that led me to what is going to be our opening episode on the topic of Alexander the Great. And even though it's impossible to talk about him and not talk about, the conquering and the destruction of the Achaemenid Empire, we'll touch on that, but I don't think it's going to be the main topic of our discussion of Alexander the Great. We'll talk about it, the people that were close to Alexander. We will talk about some of his achievements and why, from a modern perspective, or at least my amateur, a fan of history perspective, why I think it's interesting to talk about X instead of talking about Y. So we'll be talking about these things, and as we're going through it, as I'm building the overarching kind of theme of this podcast series on Alexander the Great, as I get started in my research, I've about 85% done my research by the time I'm recording this episode, and this is at the end of October. If you're wondering when I'm actually recording this specific episode, give you an idea of how far ahead I'm doing research for future podcast episodes. This is 3 months away, and I started my research earlier than that on Alexander the Great. So I've been reading various articles about Alexander the Great, some written by historians, some by other podcasters. I've been reading novels, or not novels, but research books about Alexander the Great. Do we have Persian accounts of Alexander the Great? And of course, the Anabasis of Alexander, which is, I guess, one of the seminal books that, if you're interested in Alexander the Great, you should read this book. So as I've been pulling all these things in together, religion keeps popping up, but it's something that's in the background. So I want to pull that into the foreground, because I have a feeling, as we talk about Alexander the Great, as we talk about the Macedonians, as we talk about the Persians in the Achaemenid Empire, in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Iraq, as we talk about Egyptians, as we talk about the Indians in the Punjab area, like northern India, religion is a theme that I see in my reading that keeps popping up over and over and over again, but it's a background thing. I think I'd like to pull that to the foreground and explore it a little more. So as we talk about Alexander the Great, the people that are around him and who they are and what they're doing, we're going to be keeping this theme of religion near the forefront. So we're going to tell a story about a religious event that Alexander the Great and really any Greek would have experienced, so that as we bring up religion again and again and again as we go through our various events in the timeline of Alexander the Great, you'll have something that you can emotionally attach to in order to understand the significance of it in the time of Alexander. This has been my little meta episode to talk about how I approach my research, how I approach picking the topics, even though kind of the main topics, it's our theme for season 1 is the lore of the Warhammer 40,000 popular fiction universe and how that attaches to our own history. So the main events there have already been picked for me. Alexander the Great, the destruction of the Tower of Babylon, Proto-Hittite Anatolian, Theseus and the Minotaur. Coming up will be the life of Jesus and also of a couple of saints. These are things that have already been picked for me because they exist in the lore of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. But what do I pull out of that to make that interesting for you? That's what I do, and that's how this podcast comes together. So I just wanted to have a little meta episode and just talk a little bit about how I approach the research, how I approach picking the topics, how I approach talking about the little tidbits of events. Why did I talk about X? Why didn't I talk about Y? That type of thing. I hope you found this little episode interesting. It's just a little meta episode to just talk about how I approach building the podcast. So thanks very much for your time. Have a very Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year. And I will catch you in the new year when we start blasting out our episodes on Alexander the Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.